I want to basically make one very succinct point that I want to convince you of, which is that when it comes to thinking about the future of virtue and vice, the future of our values, the future of morality, one big thing that we need to focus on, at least one of the big things that we need to focus on, is the idea of how do we scale up our moral infrastructure? How do we scale up our norms and values and the institutions and social practices that we build for ourselves to organize the way we live together? And I'll just try to explain what that means. Think of two things. First of all, think of how we as a species used to live, and then think about how I personally came here today. First, the one thing, how we used to live. And often this idea is captured in the concept of an EEA, an environment of evolutionary adaptedness, right? Back in the day, however you want to zero in on that time frame, back in the day, we used to live in a certain environment, and it left an imprint on our psychology and on the kind of species that we are, that left an imprint on human nature, essentially. A hostile environment, great competition between groups, scarce resources, a volatile climate, and perhaps most importantly, we used to live in very, very small groups. And in these small groups, cohesion would be maintained by very, very specific and distinct mechanisms. One would be kinship. So almost everyone in these small groups of maybe a dozen people, maybe 50 people, but usually less than 100, certainly less than a couple of hundred, you would be very closely related to many of these individuals. And another thing is reciprocal exchange. So you'd be personally acquainted with these people, and today I help you, tomorrow you help me. Reciprocity, right? But it's pretty easy in these small groups to have a kind of social bookkeeping about what's going on, who did what, who helped whom, how much, and it's very easy to know who's related to you and to what degree. That's how we used to live. Now, think about how I came here, why I'm here today. So a couple months ago, basically, I received a message from a stranger asking me, look, would you like, a couple months from now, would you like to come to a different country, fly across the sea, where you'll be picked up by a man that you've never met before, and that you'll never meet again. And that man, you will enter that man's car, and that man will drive you for 2 hours to a location where you've never been, somewhere deep in the Swedish countryside. And you will spend 2 days and 1 night with a group of people that you have never met in an abandoned factory. And my response was, yeah, okay, that sounds good. And now I'm here. But just imagine how different your frame of mind has to be, your level of trust, the kinds of norms and expectations that you have about how society functions and how it works and what makes people tick, to make that kind of deal. And it never even crossed my mind. Well, it did cross my mind in coming up with that example, but it never even, emotionally really affected me that that is an insane thing to do, right? And for almost all of human history would be absolutely out of the question, and people would, rightly so, strongly advise against doing something so bizarre and dangerous and mortally risky. But now we're here, and it turned out, in fact, as I knew beforehand, it turned out to be fine. But just imagine the kind of difference in our psychology, in our moral psychology, in what kinds of norms we appreciate and embrace, the values that we hold dear, that make that kind of cooperation amongst perfect strangers in a very, very interesting and amicable and fruitful and productive way even possible. We have a kind of new ability that consists in this scaling up of morality that allows us to interact not just in these small groups that we evolved in, surrounded only by people that we know intensely well and that are related to us, but we can interact with strangers all over the world in productive ways, either economically or academically or scientifically or technologically or politically. And that is a very, very important accomplishment. And it is not just this idea, but it's one of the ideas that feature prominently in this book I wrote on the sort of origins and world history of morality, that has these 7 chapters. That starts 5 million years ago, then 500,000, 50,000, 5,000, 550 in 5 years, and 5 years is about the present and the sort of current culture wars and cultural, symbolic, moral conflicts. But of course, many people want to know, well, what comes next? What is the future of morality and the future of our virtues and our vices, and how will we think about morality, and how will our normative infrastructure and our institutions develop in the future? And you see that basically one way of reading this story is not just a story about temporal stages, 5 million and so on and so on and so on, but it's also a story about group size, about scaling up morality and scaling up cooperation to integrate ever larger groups, and the mechanisms that make that possible. So you see, way back in the day, we had, like I said, kinship and reciprocity as the main mechanisms that would secure cohesion in a group and lead to altruism and dispositions to cooperate and to behave morally and socially and so on and so on. But we had to layer various other mechanisms on top of these foundations to scale up our moral systems and build ever larger groups. We had to start engaging in punishment, third-party punishment. So that's when I punish someone else for doing something to you, right? We had to become cultural beings that can live on the basis of essentially made-up norms, how to dress, how to behave, how to talk, which language to speak, and all sorts of cultural institutions that we would use to, again, scale up our cooperative structures. Hierarchy and inequality became important once we started generating an economic surplus that could be appropriated by a small social elite. And we've been living under these sorts of conditions of intense hierarchy and economic, material, and political inequality for the past 12,000 years up until today. The emergence of modernity brought us individualism and a revolution that very much de-emphasized the importance of kinship ties between people. And that's when people, for the first time, became intensely capable of cooperating with strangers in running, for instance, participatory politics, democracy, and so on and so on. I mean, very long-term developments, of course. Trade and interconnected, at a certain point, globally interconnected markets started to emerge. And one of the main lessons, at least, of the 20th century was that was also about scalability of morality and cooperation, namely that the reanimation of ethnic and racial conflict that happened in the first half of the 20th century is a very, very bad and risky idea, and should, in almost all cases, can be harmless in some cases, but should be, in the vast majority of cases, should be de-emphasized and overridden, because we already sort of naturally gravitate towards that idea. And in recent years, there was a big resurgence of the idea of identity. Which group do I belong to, and what are the advantages and disadvantages that accrue to the group that I belong to? And that can be an ethnic idea, that can be a sexual idea, it can be about religion, it can be any kind of way of carving up the social world. And again, the question is, if we have these mechanisms that all in their own different ways allowed us to scale up cooperation, what is the thing that comes next? Because we already know that the moral problems, the social problems, the political problems, the technological problems that we are already confronted with right now, they are problems that are characteristically about a global world. They are problems that could only emerge in a society that operates at a global level. And they require to be solved a society that can scale up its own cooperative efforts to yet another level. Unfortunately, we know that in many cases in history, that kind of transition to the next level, so to speak, has not succeeded. But we know that one of the central issues of our time is how do we manage to once again scale up our ability to cooperate on the level that we need to cooperate on in order to face all of these problems and solve them as well as we can. Because neither nuclear war, nor AI risk, whatever you think of it, nor international trade, climate change, geopolitical conflict, new informational environment, pandemics, migration, and also, which I forgot to add, how we deal with animal industry. None of these problems can even be begun to be addressed, let alone solved, unless we manage to find scalable solutions that allow us to address all these problems at the level that they need to be addressed at. I think that that's one of the reasons why. And the point that I'm making is not that recent progressive movements or whatever have been all bad. I think there are many good ideas in them, some bad, some good. But I think in principle, when you think about the problem this way, when you think about what we need to find is institutions that scale to the problems that they need to be scaled to, emphasizing social identities that are not shared is probably a problem, right? It's probably a problem to emphasize divisions between people, features that they have that they do not share, group membership to this or that group. Again, I'm not saying that that's always a bad idea. Just in terms of tackling that type of problem, it's probably should probably be somewhat de-emphasized to lean even more into the kinds of social identities that we are already predisposed to lean towards. And instead, what we need to solve and address all of these problems is something, well, we don't know yet, but it's going to be something like scalable cooperative structures and the corresponding virtues and the discouragement of the corresponding vices that facilitate cooperation among globally interconnected strangers in a way that's equal and inclusive and for mutual benefit. And I think for that, it's probably a better idea to seek recourse in a shared humanity, shared moral values, and the kinds of abilities and characteristics that we all share together, such as our common humanity, reason, and the possibility to live together in peace and friendship. Thank you.
The outlook for global morality looks quite bleak now. Will it take a serious global crisis to drive people together and say that we share a common future?
Yeah, I don't think it looks bleak. I'm happy to admit, or unhappy to admit, that there have been a couple of recent developments, of course, that have very saliently reminded us of the fact that violent conflict isn't over, that new diseases can pop up, that group hostility is very, very easy to reactivate and to exploit politically. So this is all real. But I think at the same time we also see that there is a very, very strong rejection of the idea that we should normalize violent conflict. There was a very, very strong outcry of shock and surprise upon the very idea that there could be war in Europe. Whereas 100 years ago, the idea that there should be war in Europe was, well, of course, what else? That's what we do. It's like what we're best at. So I think sometimes it is an increased sensitivity to certain issues that makes them loom very large, which then generates the impression that we're living in bleak times. I think overall that's not true, but of course bleak stuff happens and will keep happening. And I'm hoping that we find precisely those types of solutions, because we see that as long as we don't have not a globally homogeneous, but a globally integrated world, we don't really know how to deal with conflicts between countries or ethnicities or religions in a way that doesn't involve risking larger war, leading to further divisions and so on and so on and so on. So I think it's not bleak, but it shows that it confirms that very idea that we need to find these global structures.
But is it global morality possible in view of all these different cultures, religions and political systems that we have been witnessing today?
I think it's possible. I think we already have it. There's very, very good research, very solid, very rigorous research that shows that there is, in fact, a rich menu of moral and ethical values and ideas and traits that are universally appreciated. If you want to know what they are, write me an email. I'm happy to give you stuff to read. But I'm just saying there's lots of very, very good, very recent empirical evidence that definitely shows that that type of shared human morality does exist. I think often when there seem to be value conflicts or cultural value differences, often what we see is that these are at the expense of the vast majority of people in some other place that are exploited by an oppressive elite. And in many, many cases, I think there are people in this or that country that you may think of right now when we think of examples like that, where people would say, no, I would much rather be freer. I would much rather be in a more liberal society, and so on and so on. I would much rather, run my own shop and be and not be harassed by my government. Alas, they are being harassed by their governments or by other types of extractive elites and institutions, and that generates the impression that there are these cultural value differences. Empirically, I think they don't exist, and in fact, we are doing these exploitative elites a favor when we immunize them from criticism, when we grant them the idea that there are these cultural differences.
This morality was codified in the Charter of the United Nations, or at least attempt to codify it. And today, the United Nations is maybe weaker than it has been before. Maybe
I think it's the right idea. It goes in the right direction to have some sort of integrated structure that moves states out of the state of nature that they are in between them, right? So just like you want to have social structures and institutions that mitigate the state of nature between individuals, so that people can live peaceful lives and benefit from each other, rather than be in perpetual conflict. Just like that, it's a good idea, worth doubling down on, to have a kind of global structure like that. So in principle, it's a good idea. It's hard to measure whether it's weaker now or not, because it could also be the problems that get bigger. But in principle, it's the right direction, and it's, I think, worth trying to preserve something like that.
Thank you for your optimism.